I still remember that Saturday afternoon in June 2019, standing in the elegant ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel in Chicago, watching my beautiful daughter Sarah walk down the aisle in her stunning white gown. It should have been the happiest day of my life, watching my baby girl marry the love of her life. Instead, it became one of the most humiliating experiences I'd ever endured as a plus-size woman in America. At 58 years old, I weighed around 280 pounds, and I'd spent months searching for the perfect mother-of-the-bride dress. After visiting countless stores and dealing with limited options in my size 24, I finally found a beautiful navy blue dress with delicate lace sleeves that made me feel elegant and confident. I thought I looked wonderful that morning when I got ready, carefully applying my makeup and styling my graying hair into an updo that took me 2 hours to perfect. But confidence is a fragile thing when you're a large woman in a society that constantly judges your worth by your size. The moment I walked into the reception area after the ceremony, I could feel the stares. My husband's family had always been thin, athletic people who prided themselves on their appearances and their judgmental attitudes toward anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. I was standing near the cocktail hour buffet, trying to decide whether I should even put food on my plate, knowing how they would watch and comment on every bite I took, when I heard my sister-in-law Margaret's voice cutting through the ambient conversation like a knife through butter. She was talking to her daughters, my husband's nieces, but she spoke just loud enough for me to hear every devastating word. "Look at Linda over there," Margaret said with a cruel laugh that made my stomach drop. "I can't believe she chose that dress. It makes her look like a stuffed sausage about to burst. And at her age, you'd think she'd have more dignity than to squeeze herself into something so tight. Poor Sarah, having to have wedding photos with that embarrassment of a mother." The words hit me like physical blows. I felt my face burn with shame as I pretended not to hear, focusing intensely on the shrimp cocktail display in front of me. But Margaret wasn't finished. Her voice carried easily across the small space as she continued her commentary for the entertainment of the other family members who had gathered around her. "Remember when she was younger and actually tried to be attractive?" Margaret continued, and I could hear the snickers from the others. "Now she's just let herself completely go. It's disgusting, really. David should be ashamed to be seen with her. I heard she can't even fit in regular airplane seats anymore. They have to buy her 2 tickets just to travel. Imagine the humiliation." I wanted to disappear. I wanted to run to the bathroom and hide, or better yet, leave the reception entirely. But this was my daughter's wedding day, and I couldn't abandon her just because I was being verbally assaulted by people who were supposed to be family. I forced myself to stay rooted to that spot, even as tears threatened to spill down my carefully made-up cheeks. The worst part wasn't just the cruelty of the words, it was the laughter that followed. These were people I'd known for over 30 years, people I'd cooked for, people whose children I'd babysat, people I'd considered family, and they were treating me like a circus freak, an object of ridicule to be mocked and dismissed. The pain wasn't just emotional, it was physical, a crushing weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. If this story of a courageous plus-size woman has already moved you, hit that like button now so more people can watch this video. Before I tell you how this story ends, and trust me, it gets so much better, I need you to understand who I was before that devastating moment at my daughter's wedding. Because the woman who got crushed by those cruel words wasn't always the empowered person you're going to meet by the end of this video. My name is Linda Patterson, and I've been living in the suburbs of Chicago for most of my adult life. I married my husband David when I was 26 years old, back in 1987, and at that time I weighed about 140 pounds. I was considered conventionally attractive by society's standards. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a size 8 figure that fit easily into any clothing store's offerings. David's family loved me then. They welcomed me with open arms, invited me to all their gatherings, and treated me like the daughter they never had. But life has a way of changing your body, especially when you're a woman. After Sarah was born in 1990, I gained weight during pregnancy and struggled to lose it afterward. Then came my son Michael 2 years later, and more weight that seemed determined to stay put despite my best efforts. By the time I was 35, I was wearing a size 14, and I started noticing subtle changes in how David's family treated me. The comments began small and seemingly innocent. "Oh, Linda, are you sure you want that second helping?" Margaret would ask with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know, I read an article about metabolism slowing down after pregnancy. Maybe you should try that new diet I saw on television." Her daughters would nod sympathetically, as if my body was their concern and their problem to solve. David, bless his heart, never said anything directly about my weight gain, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes when I'd try on clothes for special occasions. He'd say I looked fine in that tone of voice that clearly meant the opposite. When we'd go shopping together, he'd steer me toward the gym equipment section of stores, dropping hints about elliptical machines and weight sets that I never asked for and definitely didn't want. By my 40s, I was solidly in plus-size territory, shopping in the back sections of department stores and online for clothes that actually fit my changing body. I tried every diet you can imagine: Weight Watchers, Jenny Craig, Atkins, South Beach, that terrible cabbage soup diet that made me feel sick for weeks. I'd lose 20 or 30 pounds, get excited about the progress, and then gain it all. Back plus more within a year. The truth is, I was fighting a losing battle against genetics, hormones, and a food industry designed to keep people like me trapped in cycles of shame and temporary success. But I didn't understand that then. I thought I was failing, that I lacked willpower, that I was somehow fundamentally broken as a person. David's family certainly reinforced that belief every chance they got. During family gatherings, they'd make sure to seat me in chairs without arms, supposedly for my comfort, but really because they were embarrassed by the possibility that I might not fit. They'd order salads when we went to restaurants together, making pointed comments about healthy choices while watching to see what I would order. Margaret once actually reached over and moved the bread basket away from my side of the table, explaining that she was helping me stay on track. I developed what I now recognize as disordered eating patterns. I'd starve myself before family events, trying to appear smaller and more acceptable. I'd eat secretly at home, hiding food purchases from David and consuming entire packages of cookies or ice cream in shame-filled binges that left me feeling disgusted with myself. I avoided cameras, declined invitations to social events, and gradually withdrew from activities I once enjoyed because I was convinced that my body made me unworthy of taking up space in the world. The worst part was that I started believing their narrative about my worth. I accepted that my value as a person was directly tied to the number on the scale. I internalized their disgust and made it my own, looking in mirrors with hatred instead of acceptance, buying clothes that were supposed to hide and minimize my body instead of celebrate it. By the time Sarah announced her engagement in 2018, I was 57 years old and completely convinced that I was an embarrassment to my family. I'd spent decades shrinking myself emotionally, even as my body grew larger, accepting crumbs of respect and affection from people who should have loved me unconditionally. I was the perfect victim for their cruelty because I'd already been practicing it on myself for years. But sometimes, rock bottom becomes the foundation for something beautiful. Standing in that hotel ballroom, listening to Margaret's vicious commentary about my body, I felt something break inside me that went far deeper than hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was the complete shattering of whatever remaining self-worth I'd been clinging to, the final destruction of the illusion that these people might someday accept me if I just tried hard enough to be smaller, quieter, less offensive to their sensibilities. The physical sensations hit me first. My heart started racing so fast I could hear it pounding in my ears, drowning out the classical music playing softly in the background. My hands began trembling uncontrollably, and I had to set down the small plate I'd been holding because I was afraid I'd drop it and create even more of a scene. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, threatening to ruin the makeup I'd spent an hour applying that morning. But the emotional impact was even more devastating. 30 years of marriage to David, 30 years of trying to be the perfect wife, mother, and family member, and this is what I got in return. Public humiliation at my own daughter's wedding. Every birthday party I'd attended, every holiday dinner I'd cooked, every time I'd bitten my tongue when they made their helpful comments about my appearance, none of it mattered. To them, I was nothing more than entertainment, a cautionary tale they could point to and say, "At least we're not like Linda." I found myself thinking about all the times I'd made excuses for their behavior over the years. When Margaret would make comments about my food choices, I'd tell myself she was just concerned about my health. When David's mother would suggest I might be more comfortable sitting in the back row at family photos, I'd convince myself she was being thoughtful about my self-consciousness. When his brother would joke about needing to reinforce chairs before I arrived for dinner, I'd force myself to laugh along and pretend it didn't cut me to the bone. But standing there, listening to them dissect my appearance like I was a specimen in a laboratory, I finally understood that their cruelty wasn't accidental or well-intentioned. It was deliberate. They enjoyed making me feel small and worthless. My pain was their entertainment, and my presence gave them someone to feel superior to. For 3 decades, I'd been the family scapegoat, and I'd been so grateful to be included at all that I'd never questioned why inclusion had to come at such a brutal cost. The shame was overwhelming. Not just shame about my body, but shame about my stupidity in believing things would ever be different. Shame about the years I'd wasted trying to earn respect from people who were incapable of giving it. Shame about the example I'd set for my daughter, showing her that women should accept mistreatment and devalue themselves to keep the peace. I thought about Sarah, radiant in her wedding dress, and wondered what she would think if she knew what was happening just a few feet away from her celebration. Had she heard these kinds of comments about her mother before? Had she grown up watching me be diminished and dismissed, learning that this was normal behavior in families? The thought made me feel sick to my stomach. The urge to run was almost irresistible. I wanted to grab my purse, find David, and tell him I was suddenly feeling unwell and needed to go home. I could skip the dinner, the dancing, the speeches, all the parts of the evening where I'd be visible and vulnerable to more attacks. I could disappear into my house and never see these people again. And maybe that would be easier for everyone involved. But as I stood there contemplating my escape, something else began stirring underneath all that pain and humiliation. It started as a tiny spark of anger, barely noticeable beneath the crushing weight of shame. How dare they talk about me like I wasn't even human? How dare they use my daughter's wedding as an opportunity to tear me down? How dare they pretend to be good, moral people while engaging in behavior that was nothing short of emotional abuse? The anger felt dangerous and unfamiliar. For years, I'd been trained to turn negative emotions inward, to blame myself for other people's cruelty, to accept that I deserved poor treatment because of my size. But this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something that could either destroy me completely or become the foundation for a completely different kind of life. I looked around the room at all these thin, conventionally attractive people who thought they were better than me because of what they saw in the mirror. Margaret, who'd been married and divorced 3 times but still felt qualified to judge other people's worth. David's nieces, who spent their days posting filtered selfies on social media and their nights drinking wine and complaining about their empty lives. His brother, who hadn't spoken to his own children in 5 years but felt comfortable making jokes about other people's families. These were not good people. These were not people whose opinions should matter to me. These were small, petty individuals who needed to tear others down to feel better about their own inadequacies. And I had spent 30 years giving them power over my self-worth. That realization didn't make the pain go away, but it planted a seed that would eventually grow into something much more powerful than their cruelty. As I stood there absorbing Margaret's latest attack, My mind began flooding with memories of all the other times David's family had made me feel like a second-class citizen because of my size. It was like opening a photo album of humiliation, each page revealing another moment when I should have stood up for myself but didn't. I remembered Christmas dinner in 2015, when David's mother had prepared a beautiful spread of traditional holiday foods. When I reached for a second helping of mashed potatoes, she actually grabbed my wrist and said, "Oh, honey, are you sure? You know how those carbohydrates go straight to the hips." The entire table fell silent, and I felt every pair of eyes watching to see how I'd react. I laughed it off, made a joke about how potatoes were vegetables so they must be healthy, and put the serving spoon back down. But I spent the rest of that evening hungry and humiliated, watching everyone else enjoy the meal I'd been shamed out of eating. Then there was Sarah's high school graduation party in 2008. I'd worked for weeks planning the perfect celebration in our backyard, coordinating caterers, decorating, making sure every detail was beautiful for my daughter's special day. But when it came time for family photos, Margaret loudly announced that someone needed to rearrange the positioning because I was blocking too much of the background in the pictures. She physically moved me to the back row, behind shorter family members, ensuring that only my face would be visible in the photos that would commemorate Sarah's achievement. I thought about the family vacation to the beach house in North Carolina in 2012, when I'd finally worked up the courage to buy a new swimsuit and join everyone at the ocean. I was excited to spend time with my grandchildren, building sandcastles and splashing in the waves. But the moment I walked onto the beach in my size 22 one-piece, David's brother started making whale jokes. "Looks like we don't need to go whale watching this year," he announced loudly enough for other beachgoers to hear. "We brought our own." The laughter from his family members was like acid in my ears, and I spent the rest of the week wearing cover-ups and avoiding the water entirely. There was the time in 2010 when we all went to a fancy steakhouse for David's father's birthday, and the hostess tried to seat us at a regular table. Margaret made a big show of requesting a booth instead, explaining in a voice loud enough for nearby diners to hear that some of us need the extra room. She looked directly at me when she said it, and I knew she wanted everyone in that restaurant to understand that I was the problem, the reason we couldn't sit at a normal table like normal people. I remembered shopping trips where Margaret and her daughters would invite me along, only to spend the entire time making comments about how difficult it must be to find clothes in my size. They'd hold up tiny dresses and say things like, "Oh, this would be so cute on you if they made it bigger," or "Too bad this only goes up to an XL, you'd need at least a triple XL, right?" They'd pretend to be helpful while systematically destroying my confidence with every suggestion. The medical comments were particularly cruel. Whenever anyone in the family got sick or injured, someone would inevitably turn to me and say something like, "Well, at least our problems aren't self-inflicted like diabetes and heart disease." They'd discuss my health like I wasn't even in the room, speculating about my blood pressure, my cholesterol levels, my life expectancy. Margaret once actually told her teenage daughters, right in front of me, that I was a perfect example of what happens when you don't take care of yourself. But perhaps the most devastating memory was from 2017, when my grandson Tommy was born. I was so excited to meet my first grandchild, and I'd bought a beautiful rocking chair for Sarah's nursery so I could help with nighttime feedings. But when I arrived at the hospital, Margaret pulled David aside and suggested that maybe I shouldn't hold the baby until I got healthier. She claimed she was worried about my ability to support his weight safely. But I knew the real reason. She thought I was too disgusting to touch her precious grandchild. David didn't defend me. He never defended me. He'd stand there looking uncomfortable while his family tore me apart, and then later he'd tell me I was being too sensitive or reading too much into things. He'd suggest that maybe if I just lost some weight, they'd be nicer to me, as if their cruelty was somehow justified by my appearance. Each of these memories had been filed away in my mind under the category of things I need to accept to keep the peace. I'd learned to anticipate their attacks and brace myself for them, like a domestic violence victim who learns to recognize the warning signs of an impending beating. I'd developed strategies for minimizing the damage, eating before family gatherings so I wouldn't have to face judgment about my food choices, wearing loose clothing to avoid comments about my figure, staying quiet during conversations to avoid drawing attention to myself. But as I stood there at my daughter's wedding, reliving all these moments of cruelty and humiliation, something started shifting in my perspective. Instead of feeling shame about these memories, I began feeling anger about them. Why had I accepted this treatment? Why had I convinced myself that I deserved it? Why had I spent so many years protecting the feelings of people who clearly had no regard for mine? These weren't isolated incidents or misunderstandings. They were part of a systematic campaign of emotional abuse that had been going on for decades. And I had been complicit in my own destruction by refusing to name it for what it was and by continuing to show up for more punishment year after year. The pattern was so clear now that I wondered how I'd missed it for so long. But I knew the answer. I'd missed it because I'd been taught to believe that my worth as a person was determined by my size and that people had the right to treat me poorly because of how I looked. That belief was about to change everything. Something remarkable happened as I stood there surrounded by the laughter and cruelty of David's family. Instead of crumbling completely under the weight of their mockery, I found myself stepping outside of the situation mentally, as if I were watching it happen to someone else. And from that perspective, I could see clearly for the first time in 30 years just how absolutely unacceptable this treatment really was. I thought about my daughter Sarah, beautiful and confident in her wedding dress, surrounded by love and celebration on the most important day of her life so far. She had never allowed anyone to speak to her the way these people spoke to me. When she was in high school and a boy made a comment about her nose being too big, she told him exactly where he could put his opinion and never gave him another moment of her time. When her college roommate tried to criticize her study habits, Sarah packed her belongings and found a new living situation within a week. My daughter had learned to value herself, to demand respect, and to walk away from people who couldn't provide it. But where had she learned those lessons? Certainly not from watching me. For her entire life, she'd seen me accept mistreatment and make excuses for people who clearly didn't deserve my loyalty. I'd taught her what self-respect looked like by showing her the complete opposite. Standing there at her wedding, I realized I was facing a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could continue being the family scapegoat, the person everyone felt comfortable mocking and dismissing. I could keep shrinking myself to make other people more comfortable, keep apologizing for taking up space in the world, keep accepting crumbs of conditional love from people who clearly had no love to give. Or I could decide right there in that moment that 30 years of abuse was enough. The thought was terrifying. These people had been my family for 3 decades. David's approval had been the center of my universe for most of my adult life. Walking away from their acceptance, even though it was never really acceptance at all, meant stepping into completely unknown territory. It meant admitting to myself that I'd wasted years trying to earn something that was never going to be offered. But as I watched Margaret continuing her commentary about my appearance, now critiquing the way my dress pulled across my back and speculating about whether I'd had to special order it online, I felt something crystallize inside me. These people were not my family. Family doesn't treat each other this way. Family doesn't use someone's most vulnerable moments as opportunities for entertainment. Family doesn't spend decades systematically destroying someone's self-worth and then act like the victim is the problem. I thought about all the energy I'd wasted over the years trying to be smaller, quieter, less offensive to their sensibilities. All the diets I'd tortured myself with, all the clothes I'd hidden inside, all the invitations I'd declined because I was convinced my presence would ruin other people's good time. All the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, wondering why I couldn't just be normal, why I couldn't just lose the weight and become the person they wanted me to be. What if all that energy could be redirected towards something positive? What if instead of spending my time trying to shrink myself for people who would never appreciate me anyway, I focused on building a life where my worth wasn't tied to their approval? What if I stopped giving them power over my happiness and started taking responsibility for creating my own? The idea was revolutionary and terrifying at the same time. For 30 years, I'd been living my life according to other people's expectations and judgments. The thought of making decisions based solely on what would make me happy felt almost selfish. But wasn't I entitled to happiness? Wasn't I entitled to be treated with basic human dignity? Wasn't I worth more than the role of family punching bag that I'd been assigned? I looked around the room at all the thin, successful people who thought they were better than me, and I started seeing them differently. Margaret, who'd never held a job longer than 2 years and lived off alimony from her multiple divorces. David's brother, who drank too much and hadn't spoken to his own children in years because of his gambling addiction. His nieces, who spent their days posting inspirational quotes on social media while treating their actual family members with stunning cruelty. These were not people I should be aspiring to impress. These were not people whose opinions should carry any weight in my life. These were damaged individuals who needed to tear others down to feel better about their own failures and inadequacies. And I had spent 3 decades giving them power over my self-worth. The moment of decision came when I realized that my granddaughter, Sarah's future daughter, might someday be standing in a room like this, listening to people mock and dismiss someone she loved. Did I want her to learn from my example that women should accept abuse and devalue themselves to keep the peace? Did I want her to think that being larger than society's ideal meant she deserved to be treated as less than human? Absolutely not. Right there in that ballroom, surrounded by the laughter of people who had never shown me genuine love or respect, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided that this was the last time anyone would speak about me, or to me this way. I decided that I was worth more than their conditional acceptance. I decided that it was time to stop being the victim in my own life story and start being the hero. I didn't know exactly how I was going to make that transformation happen, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was going to happen. The woman who had walked into that reception hall, ashamed, apologetic, desperate for approval, was not the same woman who would walk out. And you, plus-size woman who is watching? Have you been through something similar? Tell us in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more empowerment stories. The first decision I made was surprisingly simple. I was going to finish my daughter's wedding reception with dignity. Instead of running away or hiding in the bathroom, instead of making excuses and leaving early, I was going to stay and celebrate Sarah's happiness without allowing these cruel people to diminish my joy in her special day. But this decision required me to fundamentally change how I interacted with David's family for the rest of the evening. Instead of trying to be invisible, instead of apologizing for my presence, instead of shrinking away from their attention, I was going to take up space boldly and unapologetically. If they wanted to stare at me, I'd give them something worth looking at. I walked directly over to where Margaret was holding court with her daughters and their husbands, still making comments about various family members' appearances and life choices. When I approached their little circle, the conversation stopped abruptly, and I could see the surprise in their faces. Usually, when they were being cruel about me, I'd disappear rather than confront them directly. "Margaret," I said in a clear, calm voice that carried just far enough for nearby guests to hear. "I couldn't help but overhear your commentary about my appearance. I wanted to come over and thank you for your attention to detail. It's obviously very important to you to monitor and discuss other people's bodies, and I appreciate how much time and energy you've invested in that project over the years." The sarcasm was unmistakable, and I could see her face flush red as she realized I'd been listening to every word of her cruel analysis. Her daughters looked uncomfortable, suddenly very interested in their cocktails and the floral centerpieces. Margaret started to stammer something about just being concerned about my health, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Oh, please don't apologize," I continued, maintaining that same calm, measured tone. Your concern for my health has been so consistent over the years. I'm especially grateful for how you've shared that concern publicly at family gatherings, making sure everyone understands just how worried you are about my well-being. It's really touching how much you care. By this point, other family members had started paying attention to our conversation, sensing the shift in dynamics. For 30 years, they'd watched me absorb Margaret's cruelty in silence, accepting her abuse and making excuses for her behavior. But this was something different. This was me refusing to be the victim, refusing to pretend that her comments were anything other than deliberate attempts to humiliate me. Margaret tried to laugh it off, saying something about how I was being too sensitive and taking things the wrong way, but I wasn't finished. "You know what's interesting, Margaret?" I said, still speaking in that calm, clear voice that everyone could hear. "In all these years of monitoring my health so carefully, you've never once asked me about my actual medical condition. You've never inquired about my blood pressure, which has been perfectly normal at every checkup for the past decade. You've never asked about my cholesterol levels, which are better than David's. You've never shown any interest in my stamina, which allows me to work 10-hour days in my job without any problems." I could see David approaching from across the room, probably sensing that something unusual was happening and wanting to intervene before I embarrassed his family, but I had no intention of stopping now. "So I'm curious," I continued, "about this health concern of yours. Because from where I'm standing, it seems less like concern and more like entertainment. It seems like you enjoy having someone to mock and diminish at family gatherings. It seems like my appearance gives you something to feel superior about, which must be very comforting given your own life circumstances." The silence around us was deafening. Margaret's face had gone from red to white, and her daughters were staring at their shoes, clearly wishing they could disappear. Other family members had stopped their own conversations to watch this unprecedented confrontation. David reached our little group just as I was finishing my response to 30 years of accumulated cruelty. "Linda," he said, in that warning tone I'd heard so many times before, "maybe we should—" "Actually, David," I interrupted, "I think this conversation is long overdue, don't you? I mean, Margaret has been so generous with her observations about my body for so many years. It seems only fair that I should finally acknowledge her dedication to that project." I turned back to Margaret, who was clearly struggling to figure out how to respond to this completely unexpected turn of events. For 3 decades, she'd been able to attack me with impunity, knowing I'd absorb her cruelty and never fight back. But this was a different version of Linda, one she'd never encountered before. "I want you to know, Margaret, that I've heard every comment you've made about my appearance over the years. Every joke about my size, every suggestion about my diet, every recommendation about my clothing choices. I've listened to all of it, and I've accepted it because I thought that was what family members were supposed to do. I thought that was the price I had to pay for being included." I paused for a moment, looking around at all the faces staring at me, some shocked, some embarrassed, some clearly entertained by this unexpected drama at what was supposed to be a peaceful family celebration. But today, at my daughter's wedding, I realized something important. You're not my family. Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me. Family doesn't use someone's insecurities as entertainment. Family doesn't spend decades systematically destroying someone's self-worth and then act like the victim is the problem. The power of that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. For the first time in 30 years, I wasn't apologizing for my existence. I wasn't making excuses for taking up space. I wasn't shrinking away from confrontation or trying to keep the peace at my own expense. I was telling the truth, publicly and clearly, about what had been happening to me for decades. And the truth was powerful enough to silence people who had never been silenced before. The aftermath of that confrontation with Margaret was like stepping into a completely different universe. For the rest of Sarah's wedding reception, I moved through the crowd with a confidence I'd never experienced before in my adult life. People who had ignored me for years suddenly wanted to talk to me. distant relatives approached me to share their own stories of feeling excluded or mistreated by the family. Even some of David's cousins, who had never shown me any particular warmth, seemed to regard me with new respect. But the most significant change was internal. Something fundamental had shifted inside me when I stood up to Margaret's cruelty instead of absorbing it silently. For 30 years, I'd been carrying around this belief that I deserved poor treatment because of my size, that my worth as a person was somehow diminished by the number on the scale. But in that moment of confrontation, I'd accessed a strength I didn't even know I possessed. The feeling was intoxicating. All my life I'd been told, directly and indirectly, that large women should be grateful for whatever attention they received, that we should apologize for taking up space, that we should accept criticism and judgment as the natural consequence of being visible in bodies that didn't meet society's standards. But standing there in that ballroom, I realized that none of that was true. I was a human being with value and dignity that had absolutely nothing to do with my dress size. I was an intelligent, accomplished woman who had raised 2 beautiful children, maintained a successful career in accounting for over 20 years, and contributed meaningfully to my community through volunteer work and civic engagement. My worth wasn't determined by whether I could fit into the same clothes I wore in college or whether strangers approved of my appearance. During the dancing portion of the reception, something magical happened. Sarah came over to where I was sitting and grabbed my hands, pulling me toward the dance floor. "Come on, Mom," she said with that brilliant smile that had been lighting up my life for 28 years. "This is my wedding, and I want to dance with the most important woman in my life." For a moment, I hesitated. Dancing meant being visible, being watched, potentially being judged by all the people who had spent the evening observing my confrontation with Margaret. The old Linda would have made excuses, would have insisted that Sarah dance with her friends instead, would have found a way to avoid being the center of attention. But the new Linda, the one who had just discovered her voice and her value, stood up and walked onto that dance floor with her head held high. As we moved to the music together, I felt the stares of other guests, but for the first time in my adult life, those stares didn't feel like judgment. They felt like recognition. People were seeing me, really seeing me, not as an object of ridicule or pity, but as a woman celebrating her daughter's happiness with joy and confidence. The strength I discovered that day wasn't just about standing up to bullies or refusing to accept mistreatment. It was about recognizing my own inherent value as a human being, regardless of what anyone else thought about my appearance. It was about understanding that I had the right to take up space in the world, to express my opinions, to demand respect, and to pursue happiness on my own terms. Over the following weeks, this newfound strength began manifesting in small but significant ways. When David suggested that maybe I should apologize to Margaret for causing a scene at the wedding, I looked at him calmly and said, "No, I don't think I will. Margaret owes me an apology for 30 years of cruel comments, and until I receive it, I won't be attending any family gatherings where she's present." The shock on his face was almost comical. He'd spent our entire marriage expecting me to prioritize his family's comfort over my own dignity, and he clearly had no idea how to respond to this new version of his wife who refused to be mistreated. When my co-worker Janet made one of her usual comments about my lunch choices, she had a habit of monitoring what I ate and offering unsolicited advice about portion sizes, I stopped her mid-sentence. "Janet," I said firmly, "my food choices are not your concern. Please don't comment on what I eat anymore." She looked stunned, but she never made another comment about my meals. I started speaking up in meetings at work, sharing ideas and opinions that I'd been keeping to myself for years out of fear that people would dismiss me because of my size. To my surprise, my colleagues not only listened, but often praised my insights and asked for my input on important projects. I realized that I'd been underestimating my own professional value because I'd been so focused on what I perceived as my physical shortcomings. The strength grew stronger with each small act of self-advocacy. Every time I refused to accept poor treatment, every time I asserted my worth, every time I took up space without apologizing for it, I felt more connected to my authentic self. I began to understand that confidence isn't something you have to earn by meeting other people's standards. It's something you can choose to claim simply by recognizing your own inherent dignity. I started reading books about body positivity and self-acceptance, educating myself about the ways our culture systematically undermines the self-worth of women who don't fit narrow beauty standards. I learned about the multi-billion-dollar diet industry that profits from keeping women like me trapped in cycles of shame and temporary success. I discovered communities of women who were rejecting society's messages about body size and choosing to live full, authentic lives regardless of what they saw in the mirror. Most importantly, I began to see my own story differently. Instead of viewing my weight gain as a personal failure or a character flaw, I started understanding it as a natural response to pregnancy, aging, stress, genetics, and a food environment designed to promote overconsumption. Instead of seeing myself as someone who lacked willpower or discipline, I began recognizing myself as someone who had survived decades of emotional abuse while still managing to raise children, maintain a career, and contribute to my community. Yai, woman who emerged from Sarah's wedding, was not the same person who had walked into that reception hall. She was stronger, clearer, and absolutely determined to never again allow anyone to diminish her worth because of her appearance. The weeks following Sarah's wedding became a crash course in standing up for myself in ways I'd never imagined possible. Every day seemed to present new opportunities to practice this unfamiliar skill of self-advocacy. And while it was terrifying, at first, each small victory built my confidence for bigger challenges ahead. The first major test came just 2 weeks after the wedding, when David's family planned their annual 4th of July barbecue. Traditionally, this was a command performance. Everyone was expected to attend, and absences were noted and discussed extensively. I'd been going to these gatherings for 30 years, enduring the usual commentary about my food choices, my clothing, and my general failure to meet their standards of acceptability. But this year, when David told me about the date and time, I simply said, "I won't be attending." The confusion on his face was almost comical. "What do you mean you won't be attending?" "It's the family barbecue. Everyone goes to the family barbecue." "Everyone except me," I replied calmly. "I'm no longer willing to spend my free time with people who treat me poorly. Until Margaret apologizes for her behavior at Sarah's wedding, and until the family establishes some basic ground rules about respectful communication, I'll be finding other ways to spend my holidays." David spent the next hour trying to convince me to change my mind. He used every manipulation technique in his arsenal. Guilt, "You're breaking up the family," minimization, "You're being too sensitive about what was obviously a joke," and economic pressure. "What will people think about our marriage if my wife won't attend family events?" But I'd discovered something powerful in that hotel ballroom. I didn't have to accept unacceptable behavior just to avoid conflict. I could choose my own boundaries and enforce them regardless of how other people felt about my decisions. On the 4th of July, while David attended the barbecue alone, I spent the day at a local festival with my neighbor Patricia, a woman I'd always liked but had never had time to get to know better, because I was always busy managing David's family obligations. We ate funnel cake without anyone commenting on our choices. We laughed at the terrible local band without worrying about appearing undignified, and we talked about books and politics and dreams for the future. It was one of the best holidays I'd had in years. The next act of self-advocacy came at work, where I'd been passed over for promotion 3 times despite having more experience and better performance reviews than the people who were chosen instead. In the past, I'd convinced myself that my size was the reason, that clients wouldn't want to work with a large woman, that I didn't project the right image for a leadership role, that I should be grateful just to have a job at all. But my newfound confidence made me see the situation differently. I was being discriminated against, and that discrimination was illegal. More importantly, I was allowing it to continue by refusing to advocate for myself. When the next promotion opportunity arose, a senior accounting manager position that I was perfectly qualified for, I didn't just submit my application and hope for the best. I scheduled a meeting with my supervisor to discuss my career trajectory, bringing documentation of my accomplishments, client feedback, and performance metrics that clearly demonstrated my value to the company. "I've been with this firm for 18 years," I told him, "and I've consistently exceeded expectations in every role I've held. I've brought in new clients, mentored junior staff, and contributed to process improvements that have saved the company thousands of dollars annually. I'm curious about why I haven't been considered for advancement despite this track record." My supervisor, a thin man in his 40s who had always been polite but somewhat dismissive in our interactions, seemed surprised by my direct approach. He stammered something about needing people with executive presence in leadership roles, and I pressed him to define what that meant specifically. The conversation was uncomfortable, but it was also illuminating. As he struggled to explain why less qualified candidates had been chosen over me, it became clear that his decision-making had been influenced by unconscious bias about what leaders should look like. When I pointed out that my results spoke for themselves, regardless of my appearance, he seemed to realize how weak his position was. 2 weeks later, I was offered the promotion. But perhaps the most significant act of self-advocacy during this period involved my relationship with David himself. For 30 years, I'd accepted his passive complicity in his family's treatment of me. When they made cruel comments, he'd remain silent. When I expressed hurt about their behavior, he'd minimize my feelings and suggest that I was overreacting. He'd never once stood up for me or demanded that his family treat me with respect. I'd always told myself that this was just his conflict-avoidant personality, that he loved me even if he wasn't good at defending me. But my new perspective made me see his behavior as what it really was, a choice to prioritize his family's comfort over his wife's dignity. One evening in late July, after he'd spent 20 minutes telling me about the wonderful time everyone had at a cousin's birthday party that I hadn't been invited to, I decided to address this pattern directly. "David," I said, "we need to talk about your family and how they treat me." He immediately became defensive. "Oh, come on, Linda. You're still upset about that comment at the wedding? Margaret was just joking around. You know how she is." "Yes," I replied. "I do know how she is. She's cruel and judgmental, and she's been treating me poorly for 3 decades. But what I'm more concerned about is how you are. You're my husband, and you've never once defended me or demanded that your family treat me with respect." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of our marriage, but also one of the most necessary. I explained that I could no longer be in a relationship where I was expected to absorb abuse to keep the peace. I told him that his silence in the face of his family's cruelty felt like betrayal, and that I needed him to choose between enabling their behavior and protecting his wife. It wasn't easy for him to hear, and it wasn't easy for me to say, but it was essential. For the first time in our marriage, I was demanding that he see me as a person whose feelings mattered as much as his family's comfort. These early acts of self-advocacy were like learning to use muscles I'd never exercised before. They were awkward and uncomfortable, but they were also exhilarating. Each time I stood up for myself, each time I refused to accept poor treatment, each time I asserted my worth, I felt more connected to my authentic self and more confident in my ability to create the life I deserved. As word spread through David's extended family about my confrontation with Margaret and my subsequent refusal to attend family gatherings, I found myself facing challenges I hadn't anticipated. These people, who had spent 30 years treating me as their verbal punching bag, were not pleased with my transformation. They wanted the old Linda back, the one who absorbed their cruelty silently and never made them face the consequences of their behavior. The first major challenge came in the form of a coordinated campaign to isolate me socially. Family members who had never shown much interest in maintaining individual relationships with me suddenly started calling David to express their concern about my new attitude. They suggested that I might be having some kind of mental health crisis, that my behavior at the wedding was completely out of character, and that perhaps I needed professional help to deal with my anger issues. Margaret, in particular, seemed determined to rewrite the narrative of what had happened at Sarah's wedding. She started telling people that I had attacked her unprovoked and that she was worried about my stability. She painted herself as the victim of an unhinged woman who had chosen her daughter's wedding as the venue for an inappropriate public meltdown. This gaslighting campaign was sophisticated and effective. People who hadn't witnessed the actual events began questioning my version of what had happened. Even Sarah called me one day, having heard from various family members that I'd been rude to Margaret at her wedding, and wanted to understand what had really occurred. Having to explain to my own daughter that her grandmother's family had been emotionally abusing me for decades was one of the most difficult conversations I'd ever had. Sarah was shocked and hurt that I'd never told her about the extent of their cruelty, and angry with herself for not recognizing what had been happening right in front of her. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked, and I could hear the pain in her voice. "Why did you let them treat you that way for so long?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. The answer was complicated and painful to acknowledge. "Because I believed them," I told her. "Because I thought I deserved it. Because I was so convinced that my worth was tied to my size that I accepted their judgment as truth." Sarah's support gave me strength for the next challenge, which came from an unexpected source, my own mother. At 73 years old, my mom had never been particularly supportive of my decision to speak up for myself. She'd always been a believer in keeping the peace at any cost, and she was horrified by what she saw as my destruction of family harmony. "I don't understand what's gotten into you, Linda," she said during one of our weekly phone calls. "You've been married to David for 30 years. His family has always accepted you, and now you're throwing that all away because someone made a comment about your dress? It seems very selfish and ungrateful." Hearing my own mother echo the family's narrative was devastating. Here was the woman who had raised me, who was supposed to support me unconditionally, and she was essentially telling me that I should continue accepting abuse to avoid making waves. The realization that even my mother prioritized other people's comfort over my dignity was almost unbearable. But it also clarified something important for me. This pattern of expecting women to absorb mistreatment silently wasn't just limited to David's family. It was a broader cultural problem that I'd been marinating in my entire life. My mother's generation had been taught that women's primary value lay in their ability to keep everyone around them happy, even at the expense of their own well-being. I was determined to break that cycle. The professional challenges were equally difficult, but in different ways. While I'd successfully advocated for my promotion, my new visibility in the company had also made me a target for subtle forms of discrimination that I'd been blind to before. Suddenly, I was noticing how often my ideas were dismissed in meetings. Until a male colleague repeated them, how frequently I was excluded from informal networking opportunities, and how my authority was questioned in ways that my thinner female colleagues never experienced. One particularly frustrating incident occurred during a client presentation I was leading for a major account. The client, a man in his 50s who owned a chain of restaurants, seemed completely unable to take me seriously. He directed all his questions to my male assistant, despite my clear introduction as the senior manager on the account. When I tried to redirect his attention to the materials I was presenting, he actually said, "No offense, but I'd feel more comfortable working with someone who understands the food service industry." The implication was clear. He assumed that as a large woman, I must have an unhealthy relationship with food, and therefore couldn't be trusted to understand his business. It was professional discrimination wrapped in a thin veneer of politeness, and it was infuriating. In the past, I would have accepted his dismissal and handed the account over to my assistant to avoid confrontation. But the new Linda wasn't interested in making other people comfortable at the expense of her own professional success. "I have 15 years of experience working with food service clients," I told him calmly, "and my track record speaks for itself. If you'd like to review my client, references and case studies, I'd be happy to provide them. However, if you're not comfortable working with me based on factors unrelated to my professional qualifications, I'm sure we can find another firm that would be happy to take on your account." The threat of losing our services and the implicit suggestion that his behavior might be discriminatory changed his tune immediately. We got the contract, and I made sure to document the incident in case similar issues arose in the future. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of this period was dealing with the loneliness that came with setting boundaries. Standing up for myself meant saying no to family gatherings, declining invitations to events where I knew I'd be mistreated, and limiting my contact with people who couldn't or wouldn't treat me with respect. For someone who had spent 30 years prioritizing other people's comfort over her own needs, this isolation was difficult to bear. There were many evenings when I questioned whether I was making the right choice, when the familiar routine of accepting abuse seemed easier than the uncertainty of building a new life based on self-respect. But every time I was tempted to go back to the old patterns, I remembered how it felt to stand in that hotel ballroom, listening to Margaret mock my appearance while I stood there silently absorbing her cruelty. I remembered the decades of shame and self-loathing that had resulted from accepting other people's judgment as truth. And I knew that no amount of loneliness could be worse than the soul-crushing experience of living a life where your own dignity came last. The journey from self-loathing to self-acceptance wasn't linear or easy, but it was absolutely essential. For 30 years, I'd been living with a constant internal monologue of criticism and shame about my body, and changing that narrative required deliberate, sustained effort. I had to learn to see myself through my own eyes rather than through the lens of people who had never bothered to understand who I really was. The first step was educating myself about the cultural forces that had shaped my self-perception. I started reading books by authors like Lindy West, Roxane Gay, and Jess Baker, women who had written honestly about their experiences as large women in a society that treats fat bodies as moral failures. I learned about the history of beauty standards, the way they'd changed dramatically over time, and how they were often used as tools to control and diminish women's power. I discovered that the shame I'd been carrying wasn't actually mine. It was something that had been imposed on me by a culture that profits from women's insecurity. The diet industry, the fashion industry, the entertainment industry, they all benefit when women like me believe that our worth is tied to our dress size and that we need to constantly work to shrink ourselves to be acceptable. This revelation was both liberating and infuriating. Liberating because it meant that my inability to maintain significant weight loss wasn't a personal failing. It was a normal response to an abnormal situation. Infuriating because it meant I'd spent decades hating myself for not achieving something that was never realistic or necessary in the first place. I started working with a therapist who specialized in body image issues, and through our sessions, I began to understand how deeply the messages about my inadequacy had penetrated. I'd internalized not just society's judgment about large bodies, but also my family's specific brand of cruelty. I'd been carrying around their voices in my head for so long that I couldn't distinguish between their opinions and my own thoughts. One of the most powerful exercises my therapist had me do was to write letters to my body, specifically to different parts of my body that I'd been taught to hate. At first, the assignment seemed ridiculous and embarrassing. How could I write a love letter to my stomach, which I'd spent decades trying to hide under loose clothing? How could I express gratitude to my thighs, which I'd always seen as evidence of my lack of self-control? But as I worked through the exercise, something remarkable happened. I started remembering all the things my body had done for me that had nothing to do with its appearance. My arms had held my children when they were sick. My legs had carried me through countless adventures. My hands had created beautiful things and comforted people in pain. My body wasn't just a vessel for other people's judgment. It was the vehicle through which I'd experienced joy, love, accomplishment, and connection. I wrote to my belly, thanking it for growing and nourishing my children during pregnancy. I wrote to my legs, acknowledging how they'd supported me through long days at work and dance floors at family celebrations. I wrote to my face, recognizing the wisdom in the lines around my eyes and the strength in my jaw that had learned to speak up for itself. The process was emotional and transformative. For the first time in my adult life, I was looking at my body as an ally rather than an enemy, as a partner in my life's journey rather than an obstacle to overcome. I also started making practical changes to support this new relationship with myself. I cleaned out my closet, getting rid of all the clothes that were supposed to hide and minimize my body, and invested in pieces that were designed to fit and flatter my actual size. Instead of shopping for clothes that would make me look smaller, I looked for items that made me feel powerful and beautiful. The difference was remarkable. When I wore a dress that was cut to celebrate my curves rather than disguise them, when I chose colors that complemented my skin tone instead of fading into the background, when I accessorized boldly instead of trying to be invisible, I felt like a completely different person. I started taking up space in ways I'd never allowed myself before. I accepted invitations to social events and actually enjoyed them instead of spending the entire time worried about how I looked. I joined a book club full of interesting women who wanted to discuss literature, not diet tips. I started going to the theater and concerts, sitting in whatever seats I wanted without apologies or explanations. The physical changes in how I carried myself were dramatic. I stopped hunching my shoulders to try to appear smaller. I started making eye contact during conversations instead of staring at the ground. I began walking with purpose and confidence instead of hurrying to get out of sight as quickly as possible. But the most significant change was internal. I developed what I came to think of as a protective filter around my self-worth. When people made comments about my appearance, and they still did, because some people can't resist policing women's bodies, those comments bounced off me instead of penetrating to my core. When a stranger at the grocery store felt entitled to comment on the contents of my cart, I simply ignored them and continued with my shopping. When a family member made a helpful suggestion about my clothing choices, I thanked them for their concern and changed the subject. When acquaintances asked about my weight loss journey, assuming that any large woman must be actively trying to become smaller, I politely told them that I was focused on health and happiness rather than dress size. I learned to distinguish between constructive feedback from people who cared about me and destructive criticism from people who enjoyed tearing others down. I developed the ability to hear concern about my health from my doctor without interpreting it as judgment about my worth as a person. I could accept genuine compliments without suspicion while rejecting backhanded comments disguised as support. Most importantly, I started treating myself with the same kindness and respect that I'd always shown to other people. I spoke to myself the way I'd speak to a beloved friend who was struggling. I celebrated my accomplishments without minimizing them. I forgave myself for past mistakes without carrying them as permanent shame. The woman who emerged from this process of building self-esteem was fundamentally different from the one who had walked into Sarah's wedding reception. She was confident without being arrogant, strong without being defensive, and absolutely unwilling to accept poor treatment from anyone, regardless of their relationship to her. If you believe that obese women can achieve anything, subscribe to the channel and share this video with a friend who needs to feel empowered. Once I'd established a foundation of self-respect and learned to set boundaries with people who treated me poorly, I realized that I had energy and passion available for projects I'd never imagined possible. For years, I'd been so focused on trying to shrink myself and manage other people's reactions to my body that I'd never considered what I might accomplish if I channeled that energy towards something positive and meaningful. The first solution I developed was for my own professional advancement. Having successfully advocated for one promotion, I realized that I'd been undervaluing myself and limiting my career growth for years. I started researching other opportunities both within my current company and in the broader accounting field, approaching my career with the same strategic thinking I applied to my clients' financial planning. I enrolled in a continuing education program to update my skills in new accounting software and financial analysis techniques. I joined professional organizations where I could network with other women in finance and learn about leadership opportunities. I started volunteering to speak at industry conferences, sharing my expertise on small business accounting and building my reputation as a thought leader in my field. Within 6 months, I was offered a position as Director of Financial Operations at a mid-sized consulting firm, a role that came with a 40% salary increase and the kind of executive authority I'd never imagined possible for myself. The company that recruited me was specifically interested in my track record of client retention and process improvement, and my size never came up once during the interview process. But the most meaningful solution I developed was aimed at helping other women who were experiencing the kind of treatment I'd endured for so many years. I started thinking about all the plus-size women I knew who were struggling with family dynamics similar to mine, and I realized that there was virtually no support available for dealing with this specific type of emotional abuse. I began by creating a private Facebook group called Dignity Over Drama, Support for Women Facing Family Fat Shaming. I expected maybe a dozen women to join, but within a month, we had over 200 members sharing their stories and supporting each other through similar challenges. The stories these women shared were heartbreakingly familiar. There was Janet, whose mother-in-law made comments about her weight at every family gathering and had started doing the same thing to her teenage daughter. There was Maria, whose husband's family excluded her from family photos because they said she ruined the aesthetic. There was Amanda, whose own sister made cruel jokes about her size on social media and then claimed she was just trying to motivate her to lose weight. As I read these stories and participated in conversations with these women, I realized that what we were dealing with wasn't just individual cruelty. It was a systematic pattern of abuse that was being normalized and excused because it was directed at fat women. Society had given people permission to treat us poorly in the name of health concern or tough love, and most of us had internalized the belief that we deserved this treatment. I started researching the psychological impact of weight-based discrimination and was shocked by what I found. Studies showed that fat shaming actually makes people gain weight rather than lose it, that weight-based bullying leads to increased rates of depression and anxiety, and that discrimination based on body size has health consequences that are often more severe than the supposed health risks of being fat. Armed with this information, I began developing educational materials for our support group. I created resource documents about setting boundaries with family members, scripts for responding to inappropriate comments about body size, and strategies for building support networks outside of toxic family systems. The response was overwhelming. Women started using the tools I'd developed to transform their own relationships and protect their children from the same kind of abuse they'd experienced. They shared success stories about standing up to in-laws, setting boundaries with parents, and teaching their daughters to value themselves regardless of their dress size. Seeing the impact of this work inspired me to think bigger. I started a blog called Reclaiming Dignity, where I wrote about my own experiences and shared research about the reality of living as a large woman in America. I wrote about the discrimination we face in healthcare, employment, and social situations. I wrote about the myth of the obesity epidemic and the reality of weight cycling and diet failure. I wrote about the importance of body autonomy and the right to exist in a larger body without constantly justifying that existence to other people. The blog grew quickly, attracting readers from around the world who were hungry for honest conversations about body size and dignity. I started receiving emails from women thanking me for giving them permission to stop hating themselves, for helping them understand that their worth wasn't tied to their dress size, and for providing them with tools to demand better treatment from the people in their lives. As my platform grew, I began speaking at conferences and workshops about weight-based discrimination and family dynamics. I developed presentations for healthcare providers about treating large patients with dignity, for HR professionals about size-inclusive workplace policies, and for parents about raising body-positive children. The most rewarding speaking engagement was at a conference for plus-size women's health, where I shared my story of transformation from victim to advocate. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of hundreds of women who had experienced similar struggles, I felt connected to a community and a purpose that I'd never known existed. But perhaps the most significant solution I developed was within my own family system. After months of setting boundaries and refusing to attend gatherings where I would be mistreated, I decided to propose an alternative approach. I organized a family meeting, not with David's extended family, but with our immediate family, David, Sarah, Michael, and their partners. I explained what I'd learned about weight-based discrimination, shared research about the health impacts of fat shaming, and proposed new ground rules for how we would discuss body size and food choices in our family. The conversation was difficult, but productive. Sarah and Michael had never fully understood the extent of their father's family's cruelty, and they were shocked to learn about the decades of abuse I'd endured. They committed to speaking up if they witnessed inappropriate behavior and to protecting their own future children from these harmful messages. David, who had been struggling with the changes in our marriage and his relationship with his extended family, finally began to understand the impact of his silence over the years. He agreed to attend therapy with me, to work on communication patterns, and to confront his own unconscious biases about body size and worth. These solutions weren't just Band-Aids covering old wounds. They were systematic changes designed to prevent the same patterns from repeating in future generations. I was determined that my granddaughter, if Sarah chose to have children, would grow up knowing that her worth had nothing to do with her dress size and everything to do with her character, kindness, and contributions to the world. The first major victory came exactly 1 year after Sarah's wedding, when I received a phone call that would validate everything I'd been working toward. It was Margaret, and she was crying. "Linda," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I need to talk to you. Can we meet for coffee?" My first instinct was to decline. I'd built a good life without her toxicity, and I had no desire to open myself up to more of her abuse. But something in her tone made me curious. This wasn't the smug, superior Margaret I'd known for 30 years. This was someone who sounded genuinely distressed. We met at a small cafe near my office, and the woman who sat across from me bore little resemblance to the confident bully who had tormented me at family gatherings. Margaret looked older, more fragile, and there was something desperate in her eyes that I'd never seen before. "I owe you an apology," she began, and I nearly dropped my coffee cup. In 30 years, I'd never heard Margaret apologize to anyone for anything. Not just for what I said at Sarah's wedding, but for everything. For all the years of cruel comments and deliberate humiliation. For treating you like you weren't even human. I sat in stunned silence as she continued, tears streaming down her face. She told me that her youngest daughter, Emma, had gained weight during her first year of college and had come home for Christmas vacation struggling with an eating disorder. When Emma had finally broken down and told her family about her struggles, she'd specifically mentioned the way her mother had always talked about Aunt Linda's weight as an example of what she never wanted to become. She told me that listening to me mock you all those years taught her to hate her own body, Margaret sobbed. She said that watching me treat you cruelly made her believe that she deserved to be treated the same way when her body changed. "She's been making herself throw up, Linda. My beautiful daughter has been poisoning herself because of the toxic messages I taught her about women's worth." The irony was devastating and perfect. Margaret's cruelty toward me had come full circle. to damage her own daughter, the person she loved most in the world. The judgmental attitudes she'd modeled had created exactly the kind of suffering she'd thought she was protecting her family from. Emma had been hospitalized for complications related to her eating disorder, and during family therapy sessions, the connection between Margaret's treatment of me and Emma's self-destructive behavior had become impossible to ignore. The therapist had helped them understand that the constant commentary about my body had created an environment where Emma learned that women's worth was tied to their dress size and that gaining weight made someone deserving of ridicule and rejection. "I need you to know," Margaret continued, "that I was wrong about everything. The way I treated you was inexcusable, and it had nothing to do with health or concern. I was jealous of you, Linda. You had this confidence in other areas of your life, this competence and intelligence, and the only way I could feel superior was by focusing on your weight. It was petty and cruel, and I'm so sorry." This confession was more than I'd ever expected to receive, but it was also deeply satisfying. For years, I'd wondered if I was being too sensitive, if I was reading malice into comments that were meant to be helpful. But Margaret's admission confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Her behavior had been deliberately cruel, motivated by her own insecurities rather than any genuine concern for my well-being. But the most significant victory wasn't Margaret's apology. It was my response to it. The old Linda would have immediately forgiven her, would have minimized the damage she'd caused, would have rushed to make Margaret feel better about her guilt and shame. But the new Linda understood that forgiveness is a process, not a single moment, and that accepting an apology doesn't mean pretending that the harm never happened. "I appreciate you telling me this, Margaret," I said calmly, "and I hope Emma gets the help she needs. But I need you to understand that your apology doesn't erase 30 years of damage. It's going to take time for me to process this, and I'm not ready to go back to family gatherings and pretend that everything is fine between us." She nodded, still crying, and asked if there was anything she could do to make amends. I told her that the best thing she could do was commit to never commenting on anyone's body size again, to get her own therapy to understand why she'd felt the need to tear other people down, and to model better behavior for her daughters and granddaughters. The second major victory came in my professional life when I was invited to keynote a national conference on workplace discrimination. The organization had read my blog and wanted me to speak about my experiences with size-based bias in professional settings. Standing on that stage in front of 800 HR professionals, business leaders, and advocates, I felt the full power of my transformation. 5 years earlier, I'd been a woman who was afraid to speak up in staff meetings. Now I was sharing my story with hundreds of people and providing them with tools to create more inclusive workplaces. The response to my presentation was overwhelming. Companies started reaching out to me for consulting services, wanting help developing size-inclusive policies and training programs. I began working with organizations to review their hiring practices, their employee wellness programs, and their workplace cultures to identify and eliminate weight-based discrimination. Within 6 months, I had enough consulting work to leave my traditional accounting job and start my own firm. Dignity Consulting specialized in helping companies create inclusive environments for employees of all sizes, and the demand for these services was greater than I'd ever imagined. But the victory that meant the most to me was personal and unexpected. David, who had struggled with my transformation and the changes in our marriage, finally had his own breakthrough during one of our therapy sessions. We'd been working with our counselor for several months, discussing communication patterns and examining the dynamics that had allowed his family's abuse to continue for so long. David had been resistant at first, insisting that his family's behavior wasn't that bad, and that I was overreacting to what he saw as minor slights. But during one session, our therapist asked him to imagine how he would feel if his coworkers spent 30 years making jokes about his receding hairline, his age, or his professional competence. She asked him to consider how it would affect him if the people he saw as family treated him as a source of entertainment rather than a person deserving of respect. The exercise was revelatory for him. For the first time, he was able to see his family's treatment of me from my perspective rather than dismissing it as harmless teasing. He realized that his silence hadn't been neutral. It had been complicity in my abuse. "I failed you," he said, tears in his eyes. "For 30 years, I failed to protect you from people who were supposed to be our family. I let them hurt you because it was easier than confronting them, and I'm so sorry." His apology opened the door to honest conversations about our marriage that we'd never been able to have before. We talked about the ways that internalized fat phobia had affected our relationship, about the pressure I'd felt to be grateful for his love because I'd been taught that large women shouldn't expect romance or passion. We worked together to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership. David committed to speaking up when people made inappropriate comments about body size, and he began educating himself about weight-based discrimination and body positivity. These victories weren't just personal triumphs, they were evidence that change was possible, that standing up for dignity and respect could create ripple effects that transformed entire family systems and communities. Each success gave me more confidence to keep pushing forward, to keep advocating for better treatment for all women, regardless of their size. The most unexpected and rewarding aspect of my transformation was discovering how powerful it could be to share my story with other women who were struggling with similar challenges. What had started as a small Facebook support group had grown into a movement that was changing lives across the country, and I was constantly amazed by the courage and resilience of the women who were choosing to reclaim their dignity. The most memorable women I worked with was Rebecca, a 52-year-old teacher from Atlanta who contacted me after reading my blog. Her story was heartbreakingly familiar. 25 years of marriage to a man whose family treated her weight as a constant source of humor and concern. Her mother-in-law had spent decades making comments about Rebecca's food choices, her clothing, and her lack of self-control, while her husband stood by silently and expected her to tolerate the abuse to keep family peace. But the breaking point for Rebecca came when her 15-year-old daughter started displaying signs of disordered eating, skipping meals, and exercising obsessively after overhearing her grandmother's latest commentary about how obesity runs in families and how important it was to catch these problems early. Rebecca reached out to me through tears, feeling desperate and trapped. She wanted to protect her daughter, but didn't know how to stand up to a family system that had been treating her poorly for decades. She'd internalized so much shame about her body that she wasn't sure she deserved better treatment, and she was terrified of the conflict that would come with setting boundaries. Over the course of several months, we worked together to develop a plan for transforming her family dynamics. I helped her practice scripts for responding to inappropriate comments, coached her through difficult conversations with her husband about his role in enabling the abuse, and supported her as she gradually implemented new boundaries with his family. The change in Rebecca was remarkable. She started speaking up when her mother-in-law made cruel comments, calmly but firmly telling her that discussions about her body were off limits. When her husband tried to minimize her concerns or pressure her to just ignore his family's behavior, she explained that she was no longer willing to model acceptance of abuse for their daughter. The process wasn't easy, and there was significant pushback from family members who preferred the old dynamic where Rebecca absorbed their cruelty silently. But Rebecca had found her voice, and she refused to be silenced again. The most powerful moment came when her daughter approached her after witnessing one of these boundary-setting conversations. "Mom," she said, "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. I never realized how badly they were treating you, and seeing you demand respect has taught me that I deserve respect too." Rebecca's daughter began speaking up when family members made comments about her eating habits or her body, using the same calm, firm tone she'd learned from watching her mother. The cycle of abuse that had been passed down through generations was finally being broken. Another woman who profoundly impacted my understanding of this work was Patricia, a 60-year-old grandmother from Oregon who had spent 40 years believing that her worth was determined by the number on the scale. Patricia had been thin for most of her adult life, but weight gain during menopause had triggered a brutal response from her adult children, who seemed to see her larger body as a personal betrayal. Her daughter would make comments about how disgusting it was that Patricia had let herself go, and her son would refuse to include her in family photos because he was embarrassed by her appearance. They staged interventions where they presented her with diet plans and gym memberships, treating her body as a problem that needed to be solved rather than accepting her as a whole person whose worth wasn't tied to her dress size. Patricia's story helped me understand that weight-based abuse isn't limited to people who have been large their entire lives. The cruelty she experienced from her own children was just as devastating as anything I'd endured from David's family, and in some ways more painful because it came from people she'd raised and loved unconditionally. Working with Patricia required helping her recognize that her children's behavior was unacceptable regardless of their motivations. Even if they genuinely believed they were helping her be healthier, their approach was emotionally abusive and was causing significant psychological harm. We developed strategies for Patricia to set boundaries with her adult children, including consequences for continued inappropriate behavior. She practiced saying things like, "I understand you're concerned about my health, but comments about my appearance are hurtful and unhelpful. If you can't visit without discussing my weight, then we'll need to limit our time together until you can treat me with respect." The transformation in Patricia's confidence was dramatic. She started wearing clothes that she enjoyed instead of trying to hide her body. She began socializing again, joining a book club and a gardening group where she formed friendships based on shared interests rather than shared shame about body size. Most importantly, Patricia started modeling self-respect for her granddaughters, showing them that women deserve to be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance. When her teenage granddaughter started making self-deprecating comments about her own body, Patricia was able to intervene with the wisdom and confidence she'd gained through her own healing journey. These individual success stories were incredibly rewarding, but I was even more excited by the broader cultural shifts I was witnessing. The blog had attracted a community of women who were supporting each other in ways that went far beyond my individual coaching. They were sharing resources, celebrating each other's victories, and creating a network of support that was transforming entire communities. Women were reporting that their daughters were more confident and body positive after watching their mothers stand up for themselves. Marriages were improving as women learned to demand respect and their partners learned to provide it. Extended family relationships were either becoming healthier through honest communication or ending entirely when people proved unwilling to change their abusive behavior. The ripple effects were extending into workplaces, schools, and medical settings as women applied the boundary-setting skills they'd learned to all areas of their lives. They were challenging size-discriminatory policies, speaking up when colleagues made inappropriate comments, and demanding better treatment from healthcare providers who had been fat-shaming them for years. I started receiving messages from women's daughters, thanking me for helping their mothers find their voices. I heard from husbands who had learned to see their wives differently after understanding the impact of weight-based discrimination. I even received letters from some family members who had been perpetrators of abuse, acknowledging their behavior and committing to change. The movement had taken on a life of its own, creating a community where women could share their stories without shame, learn tools for self-advocacy, and support each other through the difficult but necessary process of reclaiming their dignity. You see how a determined, overweight woman can change not only her life, but the lives of other people. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more stories like this. By the third year after Sarah's wedding, my life had expanded in directions I never could have imagined when I was the woman standing silently in that hotel ballroom, absorbing Margaret's cruelty. The confidence I'd gained from standing up for myself had opened doors that had been invisible to me when I was consumed with trying to make myself smaller and more acceptable to other people. The consulting business had grown beyond my wildest expectations. What had started as occasional speaking engagements had evolved into a full-service firm with 3 employees and a waiting list of companies wanting to implement size-inclusive policies. We were working with Fortune 500 corporations, healthcare systems, and educational institutions to create environments where people of all sizes could thrive without discrimination. One of our most significant contracts came from a major airline that was facing lawsuits related to their treatment of larger passengers. For years, they'd been implementing policies that were humiliating and discriminatory, requiring passengers over a certain size to purchase additional seats or move to less desirable locations on the plane. The company's leadership had finally recognized that these practices were not only morally wrong, but also legally problematic. Working with their team to develop new policies was both challenging and rewarding. We redesigned their customer service training to emphasize dignity and respect for all passengers, created protocols for addressing seating issues without shaming customers, and developed communication guidelines that focused on solutions rather than blame. The project required me to travel frequently, and I found myself in situations that would have terrified the old Linda. I was presenting to boardrooms full of executives, leading workshops for customer service teams, and being interviewed by industry publications about best practices for inclusive business policies. In one particularly memorable presentation to the airline's senior leadership team, the CEO asked me about the business case for treating larger customers with respect. It was a question that revealed how disconnected these executives were from the experiences of their customers, but it also gave me an opportunity to present data that was impossible to ignore. I showed them research about the economic impact of size discrimination, including studies that demonstrated how poorly treated customers were likely to share their negative experiences with friends and family, damaging the company's reputation and reducing future bookings. I presented statistics about the growing number of larger Americans and the market opportunity that companies were missing when they failed to serve this population with dignity. But most importantly, I shared stories from the women in my support, groups who had experienced humiliation while traveling, and how those experiences had influenced their loyalty to particular airlines. The room was silent as I described incidents of flight attendants making loud announcements about weight restrictions, gate agents requiring passengers to demonstrate that they could fit in seats, and other customers making cruel comments that went unchallenged by airline staff. The question isn't whether treating your customers with dignity is good for business, I concluded. The question is whether you can afford the cost of continuing to treat them poorly. The airline implemented our recommendations and saw immediate improvements in customer satisfaction scores and reduced complaints related to size discrimination. More importantly, they became a model for other companies in the travel industry, demonstrating that inclusive policies were both morally right and financially smart. This success led to opportunities in other industries. I was invited to work with restaurant chains on inclusive seating options, with clothing retailers on expanding their size ranges and improving their customer service, and with healthcare systems on addressing weight bias among medical professionals. Each project taught me something new about the pervasive nature of size discrimination in American society. I learned about the ways that public spaces are designed to exclude larger bodies, how medical research has historically ignored the needs of fat patients, and how employment discrimination based on size affects everything from hiring decisions to promotion opportunities. But I also learned about the incredible resilience and strength of the women who were fighting these systems every day. Through my work, I met teachers who were challenging size-based bullying in schools, healthcare workers who were advocating for better treatment of larger patients, and business leaders who were creating more inclusive workplaces despite resistance from colleagues and superiors. The most exciting opportunity came when I was invited to join a research team at a major university that was studying the health impacts of weight stigma. For years, public health messaging had focused on the supposed dangers of being fat, but this research was examining the ways that discrimination and stigma actually harm people's health regardless of their body size. Working with academic researchers gave me access to data that validated everything I'd experienced personally and witnessed in my community work. Studies showed that experiencing weight-based discrimination increased stress hormones, elevated blood pressure, and contributed to mental health problems, including depression and anxiety. The research demonstrated that the shame and stigma associated with being fat were often more harmful to people's health than their actual weight. This academic collaboration led to speaking opportunities at medical conferences, where I was able to educate healthcare providers about the impact of their unconscious biases on patient care. I shared research about how weight stigma prevents people from seeking medical care, how fat shaming by doctors leads to delayed diagnoses and worse health outcomes, and how providers could create more welcoming and effective care environments for patients of all sizes. One of the most powerful presentations I gave was to a conference of pediatricians, where I discussed the impact of weight-based bullying on children's mental health and development. I shared stories from women in my support groups who traced their eating disorders and body image issues back to comments made by healthcare providers during childhood medical visits. The response from the audience was mixed, but ultimately encouraging. While some providers were defensive about their practices, many others were genuinely shocked to learn about the unintended consequences of their well-meaning attempts to address childhood obesity. Several attendees approached me afterward to share their own experiences with weight stigma and to ask for resources to help them provide better care for their larger patients. These professional opportunities were incredibly fulfilling, but they also required me to step far outside my comfort zone on a regular basis. The woman who had once been afraid to speak up in staff meetings was now keynoting national conferences and challenging established practices in major institutions. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal and ongoing. Every new challenge required me to access deeper levels of confidence and self-advocacy than I'd needed before. Every presentation to skeptical audiences, every difficult conversation with resistant leaders, every media interview about controversial topics pushed me to grow stronger and more articulate in defending the dignity of all women, regardless of their size. The little girl inside me, who had learned to shrink herself to avoid conflict, was being replaced by a woman who understood that some conflicts were necessary, that some conversations were worth having even when they were uncomfortable, and that standing up for what's right was more important than being liked by everyone. Just when it seemed like my new life was on a steady upward trajectory, I faced the biggest challenge yet. One that tested everything I'd learned about resilience, self-advocacy, and maintaining dignity in the face of systematic opposition. The obstacle came from an unexpected source, a coordinated attack on my credibility and my work that was designed to silence me and discredit the movement I'd helped create. It started with an article in a prominent business magazine that portrayed my consulting work as politically correct extremism that was hurting companies by forcing them to accommodate unhealthy lifestyles. The piece was written by a journalist who had never spoken to me directly, but had interviewed several of my critics, including business leaders who opposed inclusive policies and medical professionals who believed that addressing weight stigma was enabling obesity. The article misrepresented my work in fundamental ways, suggesting that I was encouraging people to ignore health concerns and that my advocacy was somehow responsible for rising healthcare costs. It quoted anonymous sources who claimed that my workshops were divisive and anti-business, and it implied that companies were only hiring me to avoid discrimination lawsuits rather than because they genuinely wanted to create better workplaces. The impact was immediate and devastating. 3 companies canceled consulting contracts, citing concerns about the controversy surrounding my work. Several conference organizers withdrew speaking invitations, explaining that they couldn't risk associating their events with someone who was being portrayed as an extremist. My business, which had been thriving just weeks earlier, was suddenly in jeopardy, but the professional damage was nothing compared to the personal attacks that followed. The article had included details about my background, including my confrontation with Margaret at Sarah's wedding, and readers began sending me messages that were filled with hatred and vitriol. They called me a fat activist, as if it were a slur, told me I was destroying American values by encouraging people to accept their bodies, and suggested that I was personally responsible for the healthcare crisis. Some of the messages were explicitly threatening. People wrote detailed descriptions of violence they wanted to inflict on me, sent photos of thin women with captions about how I'd never look like them, and created fake social media profiles to harass me across multiple platforms. The volume and intensity of the hatred was overwhelming, and for the first time since Sarah's wedding, I found myself questioning whether I was strong enough to continue this work. The old Linda would have retreated immediately. She would have issued public apologies, distanced herself from anything controversial, and gone back to trying to be invisible. The fear and shame triggered by this coordinated attack felt familiar. It was the same emotional state I'd lived in for 30 years, constantly worried about other people's opinions and desperate to avoid conflict. But even in my darkest moments during this crisis, I couldn't go back to being that woman. I'd seen too much, learned too much, and helped too many other women to abandon everything I'd built because some people were uncomfortable with the idea that fat women deserved dignity and respect. Instead of retreating, I decided to respond strategically. I hired a publicist who specialized in crisis communications and a lawyer who had experience with defamation cases. I began documenting the harassment I was receiving and researching the funding sources behind some of the organizations that were attacking my work. What I discovered was revealing and infuriating. Many of my critics were connected to industries that profited from weight stigma: diet companies, weight loss surgery programs, and pharmaceutical manufacturers who sold obesity medications. The coordinated nature of the attack suggested that my work was seen as a genuine threat to their business models, which depended on keeping people ashamed of their bodies and desperate for expensive solutions. Understanding the financial motivations behind the attack helped me see it for what it really was: not a legitimate critique of my work, but a desperate attempt to silence someone who was exposing uncomfortable truths about discrimination and bias. The intensity of their response was actually validation that the work was important and effective. I started fighting back publicly, writing detailed responses to the misinformation being spread about my work and my message. I provided evidence that contradicted the claims made in the business magazine article, shared testimonials from companies that had successfully implemented inclusive policies, and presented research that supported the health benefits of reducing weight stigma. The response from my community was overwhelming and humbling. Women from my support groups organized letter-writing campaigns to the companies that had canceled contracts, explaining how my work had positively impacted their lives. Healthcare providers who had attended my presentations wrote to medical journals defending my research and challenging the myths being perpetuated about weight and health. Other advocates and researchers in the body positivity movement rallied to support me, organizing a public symposium where we presented evidence about the effectiveness of size-inclusive approaches to health and business. The event was covered by several major media outlets, giving us an opportunity to present our perspective to a broader audience. But the most powerful response came from Sarah, who wrote a blog post about watching her mother transform from a woman who accepted abuse to someone who fought for justice. She described the impact that my work had on our family, including her own relationship with her body and her plans for raising body-positive children in the future. "My mother taught me that standing up for what's right is more important than being comfortable," she wrote. "She showed me that women deserve respect regardless of their size, and that dignity is not something we have to earn by changing our bodies." The people attacking her work are the same people who spent decades trying to silence her voice, and I'm proud that she refuses to be silenced. The crisis lasted for several months, but gradually the attacks subsided as other news cycles captured public attention. Some of the contracts I'd lost were never restored, and some relationships in my professional network remained strained. but the experience had strengthened rather than weakened my resolve to continue this work. I emerged from the controversy with a clearer understanding of the forces I was fighting against, and a deeper appreciation for the community that supported me. The women who had stood by me during the attack became some of my closest collaborators, and together we developed new strategies for advancing size acceptance while protecting ourselves from future coordinated opposition. Most importantly, I learned that resilience isn't about avoiding obstacles. It's about facing them with integrity and refusing to compromise your values even when the pressure to do so is intense. The woman who survived that coordinated attack was stronger, wiser, and more committed to justice than the one who had entered it. The obstacles had tested every aspect of my transformation, from my professional skills to my emotional resilience, to my ability to maintain relationships under stress. But they had also proven that the changes I'd made were real and lasting, built on a foundation solid enough to withstand even the most determined attempts to tear it down. The pivotal moment that transformed everything came 2 years later in a way I never could have anticipated. I received a phone call on a Tuesday morning that would not only vindicate everything I'd been working toward, but would also provide the most satisfying resolution to the story that had begun in that hotel ballroom at Sarah's wedding. The call came from a producer at a major television network who had been following my work and the controversy surrounding it. She was developing a documentary series about discrimination in America, and she wanted to feature my story as an example of how individuals could challenge systemic bias and create meaningful change. "We've been researching your background," she explained, "and we're particularly interested in the family dynamics that led to your transformation. We'd like to interview you, your daughter, and some of the family members who were involved in the original incident at the wedding." My first reaction was panic. The thought of having cameras document the most painful and humiliating experiences of my life felt overwhelming. But as the producer explained their vision for the piece, I began to see the opportunity it represented. This could be a chance to share my story with millions of people, to show other women that transformation was possible, and to expose the reality of how weight-based abuse operates within family systems. The most intriguing aspect of their proposal was that they wanted to interview Margaret and other members of David's family about their perspective on what had happened. The producer had already reached out to them, and surprisingly, several had agreed to participate. I spent weeks considering whether to agree to the documentary. The idea of reliving those painful memories on camera was daunting, and I was concerned about how my family would be portrayed. But ultimately, I decided that the potential impact of sharing my story publicly outweighed the personal discomfort. The filming process was both therapeutic and challenging. Sitting in front of the cameras, talking about 30 years of emotional abuse, forced me to articulate experiences that I'd never fully processed, even in therapy. But it also allowed me to speak my truth in a way that was clear, powerful, and undeniable. The most remarkable part of the filming was the interview with Margaret. When she arrived at the studio, I was shocked by how much she had changed. The confident, cruel woman I'd known for decades had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely remorseful and eager to make amends. During her interview, Margaret spoke openly about her own struggles with body image and how she had used cruelty toward me as a way to feel better about her own insecurities. She described the impact that Emma's eating disorder had on her understanding of the damage she'd caused, and she acknowledged that her behavior had been motivated by jealousy and her own deep-seated shame. "I was intimidated by Linda," she admitted, to the cameras. "She was intelligent, accomplished, and confident in ways that I wasn't. The only area where I felt superior was in terms of physical appearance, and I used that mercilessly. I convinced myself that I was helping her by pointing out her flaws, but the truth is that I enjoyed having someone to look down on." But the most powerful moment came when Margaret was asked about the impact of my transformation on the family. Her response was something I never could have anticipated. When Linda started standing up for herself, she said, tears streaming down her face, it forced all of us to look at our own behavior. I realized that the person I'd become, someone who found pleasure in other people's pain, wasn't who I wanted to be. Her courage to change gave me permission to change too. Margaret went on to describe how she'd begun therapy to understand her own patterns of cruelty and insecurity. She talked about the work she was doing to repair her relationship with Emma and to model better behavior for her other daughters and granddaughters. She spoke about joining support groups for people who had engaged in bullying behavior and wanted to make amends. The documentary also featured interviews with other family members, including David's brother and his nieces. To my amazement, several of them acknowledged their participation in the pattern of abuse and expressed genuine remorse for their behavior. David's brother actually broke down while describing how he'd used humor to mask his own insecurities, and how watching my transformation had forced him to confront his own cruel tendencies. But perhaps the most vindicating moment came when the cameras captured a family gathering that took place during the filming process. For the first time in 5 years, I agreed to attend a family event, but this time, the dynamics were completely different. Instead of the usual pattern of cruel comments and social exclusion, family members actually sought out my company. They asked about my work, expressed interest in my advocacy, and treated me with the kind of respect I'd never experienced from them before. Margaret, in particular, seemed determined to demonstrate her changed behavior, going out of her way to include me in conversations and support my contributions to family discussions. The transformation wasn't just in how they treated me, it was in how they interacted with each other. The constant undercurrent of judgment and criticism that had characterized their gatherings for decades had been replaced by something that actually resembled kindness and mutual support. During one particularly powerful scene, Margaret's granddaughter, a teenage girl who had struggled with body image issues, approached me to talk about the impact of my advocacy work. She told me that learning about my story had helped her understand that her worth wasn't tied to her appearance, and that she'd been sharing articles from my blog with friends who were struggling with similar issues. "You saved my life," she said, simply, and I saw Margaret crying in the background as she witnessed this conversation. The documentary aired during prime time on a major network and reached an audience of over 12 million viewers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My blog saw a surge in traffic, companies reached out about consulting opportunities, and I received thousands of messages from women who said that watching my story had inspired them to make changes in their own lives. But the most meaningful response came from within my own family. David, who had initially been resistant to participating in the documentary, told me afterward that seeing our story from an outside perspective had helped him understand the full impact of his family's behavior and his own complicity in it. "I'm proud of who you've become," he said, "and I'm ashamed of who I was during those years when I failed to protect you. But I'm grateful that your courage to change has given all of us the opportunity to become better people." The documentary became a catalyst for broader conversations about family dynamics, emotional abuse, and the ways that weight stigma operates in American society. It was nominated for several awards and was used in college courses and professional training programs as an example of how individuals could challenge systemic discrimination. More importantly, it marked the completion of my transformation from victim to advocate, from someone who accepted abuse to someone who had the power to expose and challenge it. The woman who had stood silently in that hotel ballroom, absorbing Margaret's cruelty, had become someone whose voice could reach millions of people and create meaningful change in their lives. The success of the documentary opened doors that I'd never imagined possible, catapulting my advocacy work from a personal mission into a national movement that was creating systemic change across multiple industries and institutions. Within 6 months of the film's release, I was receiving invitations to speak at major universities, testify before congressional committees, and consult with international organizations about implementing size-inclusive policies. The first major recognition came when I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the American Medical Association's annual conference on health equity. Standing before an audience of 5,000 medical professionals, I presented research about the health impacts of weight stigma and challenged the medical community to examine their own biases in treating larger patients. The presentation was groundbreaking because it marked the first time that a major medical organization had given a platform to someone advocating for size acceptance rather than weight loss. I shared stories from women in my support groups who had delayed seeking medical care because of previous experiences with fat-shaming healthcare providers, and I presented data showing how this discrimination was actually contributing to worse health outcomes for larger patients. The response from the medical community was mixed but ultimately positive. While some physicians were resistant to the idea that their weight-focused approach might be harmful, many others were genuinely interested in learning how to provide better care for patients of all sizes. The AMA went on to adopt new guidelines for treating larger patients with dignity and respect, and several medical schools began incorporating education about weight bias into their curricula. This medical advocacy led to my appointment to a federal advisory committee on health disparities, where I worked with other experts to develop recommendations for addressing discrimination in healthcare settings. The committee's report, which included specific guidelines for eliminating weight bias in medical practice, was adopted by the Department of Health and Human Services and became the foundation for new federal policies protecting patients from size-based discrimination. The business world began recognizing my work as well. I was invited to join the board of directors for a major corporation that was committed to diversity and inclusion, becoming the first person appointed specifically to address size discrimination in workplace policies. In this role, I helped develop hiring practices that eliminated weight-based bias, created employee resource groups for larger workers, and established metrics for measuring the success of size-inclusive initiatives. The company's success with these policies became a model for other organizations, and I began receiving consulting requests from businesses around the world. I traveled to conferences in Europe, Australia, and Canada, sharing strategies for creating inclusive workplaces and challenging the assumption that discrimination based on body size was acceptable or inevitable. One of the most significant business achievements was partnering with a major airline to completely redesign their aircraft seating and customer service policies. Instead of treating larger passengers as problems to be managed, the airline began viewing them as valued customers whose needs deserved accommodation. They widened seats in certain sections, trained staff to handle seating issues with dignity, and developed communication protocols that prioritized respect over blame. The airline's inclusive approach not only improved customer satisfaction, but also became a competitive advantage, attracting passengers who had been poorly treated by other carriers. Their success demonstrated that inclusive policies weren't just morally right, they were also profitable, leading other airlines to adopt similar approaches. The recognition that meant the most to me, however, came from the academic world. I was offered an adjunct professorship at a prestigious university, where I taught courses on discrimination, advocacy, and social change. Working with young students who were passionate about justice and equality was incredibly energizing, and their fresh perspectives on these issues often challenged me to think more creatively about solutions. My research with graduate students led to several published papers on the psychology of weight stigma, the economics of size discrimination, and the effectiveness of different advocacy strategies. These academic publications helped establish body size discrimination as a legitimate area of scholarly inquiry and provided evidence-based support for the policy changes I was advocating. The university appointment also gave me the opportunity to mentor other advocates who were working on related issues. I supervised thesis projects on topics ranging from size discrimination in employment to the impact of weight stigma on children's development. Many of these students went on to pursue careers in advocacy, research, or policy development, creating a new generation of leaders who understood the importance of size acceptance. Perhaps the most unexpected recognition came when I was invited to speak at the United Nations about discrimination and human rights. The international perspective on these issues was fascinating and challenging as I learned about how different cultures approach body size and weight-related discrimination. My presentation to the UN Commission on Human Rights focused on the ways that weight-based discrimination violates fundamental principles of dignity and equality. I argued that access to employment, healthcare, education, and public accommodations should not be contingent on body size, and I provided examples of successful policies that had eliminated these barriers. The response from the international community was encouraging, and several countries began developing their own initiatives to address size discrimination. The European Union established a working group on weight bias that drew heavily on the research and strategies I'd developed, and several Nordic countries implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination laws that explicitly protected people based on body size. The culmination of these achievements came when I was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for my work advancing civil rights and social justice. Standing in the White House, receiving recognition from the President of the United States for advocacy that had started with a confrontation at my daughter's wedding felt surreal and deeply meaningful. In my acceptance speech, I talked about the power of individual transformation to create broader social change. I spoke about the millions of women who were still struggling with shame and discrimination based on their body size, and I challenged the audience to continue working toward a society where everyone's dignity is respected regardless of their appearance. But the achievement that brought me the greatest satisfaction was seeing the impact of my work on the next generation. Sarah's daughter, my granddaughter Isabella, was growing up in a world where body diversity was increasingly accepted and celebrated. At age 8, she already had a confidence and self-acceptance that I'd never experienced until my 50s. Watching Isabella play with friends of all sizes, seeing her express opinions without apologizing for taking up space, and witnessing her natural assumption that she deserved respect and kindness reminded me why this work was so important. The woman who had been crushed by cruelty at her daughter's wedding had helped create a world where her granddaughter would never have to experience that same pain. These extraordinary achievements were validation that standing up for dignity and respect could create ripple effects that transformed entire systems and communities. But more importantly, they were proof that the decision I'd made in that hotel ballroom to refuse to accept unacceptable treatment had been the beginning of something much larger than I ever could have imagined. By the 5th anniversary of Sarah's wedding, I had become something I never thought possible, a nationally recognized leader whose voice carried weight in boardrooms, legislative chambers, and academic institutions across the country. The transformation from a woman who couldn't speak up for herself at family gatherings to someone who was shaping national conversations about dignity and discrimination still amazed me every day. The most profound aspect of this recognition wasn't the awards or the media attention. It was the way that other women began seeing me as proof that change was possible. I received letters from women in their 70s who said that watching my transformation had inspired them to finally stand up to family members who had been mistreating them for decades. I heard from teenagers who used my story as motivation to resist bullying and discrimination in their schools. One particularly moving encounter happened at a conference in Denver where a woman named Carol approached me during the book signing, following my presentation. She was probably in her early 60s, impeccably dressed, and carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that suggested a successful professional life. But when she reached the front of the line, she began crying before she could even speak. 5 years ago, she finally managed to say, I was planning to kill myself. I had spent my entire adult life believing that I was worthless because of my size, and I couldn't see any way that things would ever get better. Then I saw the documentary about your story, and for the first time in 50 years, I realized that maybe the problem wasn't me. Maybe the problem was how other people were treating me. Carol went on to tell me about her own transformation. Inspired by my example, she had started setting boundaries with family members who had been emotionally abusive, left a job where she was facing size discrimination, and begun advocating for other women in her community who were experiencing similar challenges. She had become a volunteer facilitator for support groups and was working with local healthcare providers to address weight bias in medical settings. "You saved my life," she said simply. "But more than that, you showed me that my life was worth saving." These encounters happened regularly now, and each one reminded me of the responsibility that came with being in the public eye as an advocate. Women were looking to me not just for inspiration, but for guidance about how to navigate their own difficult situations. They wanted to know how to set boundaries with abusive family members, how to advocate for themselves in professional settings, and how to maintain their dignity in a society that often treated larger women as less than fully human. This responsibility led me to develop more structured approaches to sharing what I'd learned. I created online courses that walked women through the process of transformation, from recognizing emotional abuse to developing self-advocacy skills to building support networks. I established mentorship programs that paired women who were just beginning their journeys with others who had already made significant progress. The mentorship program was particularly close to my heart because it addressed something I'd struggled with during my own transformation: the isolation that comes with standing up for yourself when the people around you are invested in keeping you small and compliant. Having a community of women who understood the challenges and could provide support and encouragement made the process of change much more sustainable. I also began working with corporations to establish employee resource groups for larger workers, creating spaces where people could share experiences and advocate for better workplace policies. These groups became powerful forces for change within their organizations, successfully pushing for inclusive hiring practices, diverse representation in company materials, and policies that addressed size-based discrimination. The academic recognition was equally meaningful. Universities began inviting me to deliver lectures and participate in symposiums on discrimination and social justice. I was appointed to editorial boards for several scholarly journals and helped review research on weight, stigma, and body image. This academic involvement allowed me to influence the next generation of researchers and practitioners who would be working on these issues. One of the most significant academic partnerships was with a research team that was studying the long-term health impacts of my advocacy approach. They followed women who had participated in my programs for several years, measuring changes in their mental health, physical health, and social functioning. The results were remarkable. Women who learned to advocate for themselves and reject weight stigma showed significant improvements in depression and anxiety, better relationships with healthcare providers, and increased engagement in health-promoting behaviors. This research was crucial because it provided scientific validation for what I'd been observing anecdotally, that helping women reject shame and discrimination actually improved their overall well-being. The study was published in a major medical journal and became a cornerstone of arguments for size-inclusive approaches to health promotion. The media attention that came with this recognition was both helpful and challenging. I was invited to appear on major television shows, write op-eds for national newspapers, and participate in documentary films about discrimination and social change. These opportunities allowed me to reach huge audiences with messages about dignity and respect, but they also exposed me to criticism and backlash from people who were threatened by these ideas. I learned to navigate media interviews strategically, staying focused on evidence-based arguments while also sharing personal stories that helped humanize the issues. I developed skills for responding to hostile questions and dealing with attempts to derail conversations about discrimination by focusing solely on health concerns. Perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from within the advocacy community itself. Other civil rights organizations began reaching out to collaborate on initiatives that addressed multiple forms of discrimination simultaneously. I worked with racial justice groups to address the ways that size discrimination intersected with racism, particularly in how Black women's bodies were policed and judged. I partnered with disability rights advocates to challenge assumptions about health and ability that affected both communities. These collaborations taught me about the interconnected nature of oppression and helped me understand that the work I was doing was part of a much larger movement for justice and equality. The skills I'd developed in challenging size discrimination were applicable to other forms of bias and discrimination, and my platform gave me opportunities to support other marginalized communities. The recognition also brought opportunities to influence policy at the highest levels of government. I was invited to testify before congressional committees about the need for federal legislation prohibiting size-based discrimination. I worked with lawmakers to draft bills that would extend civil rights protections to include body size, and I helped organize advocacy campaigns to build support for these initiatives. This policy work was often frustrating because of the slow pace of legislative change, but it was also incredibly important for creating structural solutions to discrimination. Individual transformation was powerful, but systemic change required legal and policy interventions that would protect future generations from the kind of abuse I'd experienced. Looking back on this journey from victim to nationally recognized leader, I was constantly amazed by how far I'd traveled from that hotel ballroom where I'd first found my voice. The woman who had been afraid to contradict Margaret's cruel comments was now testifying before Congress and influencing national policy. The transformation had been complete and irreversible, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond my own life to impact thousands of other women and their families. As I sit here today, 7 years after that transformative moment at Sarah's wedding, I sometimes have to pinch myself to believe how completely my life has changed. The woman I am now bears little resemblance to the person who stood silently in that hotel ballroom, absorbing Margaret's cruelty and believing that I deserved it because of my appearance. The physical changes are the least significant, but perhaps the most visible to others. I still wear a size 24, and I may always be a larger woman, but the difference is that I now dress to celebrate my body rather than hide it. I wear bold colors, fitted clothing that shows my curves, and accessories that draw attention rather than deflect it. When I walk into a room, I take up space confidently and unapologetically. But the internal transformation has been revolutionary. The voice in my head that used to provide constant criticism about my appearance has been replaced by one that offers encouragement and support. Instead of looking in mirrors with disgust, I see a strong, accomplished woman who has overcome tremendous obstacles and used her experiences to help others. Instead of apologizing for my existence, I celebrate my contributions to the world. The professional transformation has exceeded my wildest dreams. My consulting firm now has offices in 3 cities and employs 15 people who are dedicated to creating more inclusive workplaces and communities. We've worked with over 200 companies to implement size-inclusive policies, and our research has been cited in academic journals and policy documents around the world. I've written 2 books about my experiences and advocacy work. The first, Reclaiming Dignity, A Journey from Shame to Empowerment, became a bestseller and has been translated into 12 languages. The second, Beyond Size, Building Inclusive Communities, is used as a textbook in social work and public policy programs at universities across the country. The speaking career that grew out of my transformation has taken me to 6 continents, where I've shared my story with audiences ranging from corporate executives to healthcare providers to government officials. Each presentation is an opportunity to challenge assumptions about body size and worth, and to provide practical tools for creating more inclusive environments. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation has been in my relationships. David and I have rebuilt our marriage on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership. He has become one of my strongest supporters and advocates, speaking up when people make inappropriate comments about body size and educating himself continuously about discrimination and bias. Our relationship now includes conversations about important topics that we never discussed during our first 30 years together. We talk about social justice, about the ways that privilege and oppression operate in society, and about our responsibility to use our platform to create positive change. David has become involved in my advocacy work, using his business connections to introduce me to potential clients and supporters. This transformation in my relationship with Sarah has been equally profound. She has become not just my daughter, but also my collaborator and friend. She regularly contributes to my blog, sharing her perspective as a younger woman who grew up witnessing both the abuse I endured and my eventual empowerment. Sarah's own relationship with her body has been positively influenced by watching my transformation. She raises Isabella with messages about body acceptance and self-worth that are completely different from the ones I received growing up. Isabella, now 10 years old, has a confidence and self-assurance that amazes me daily. She assumes that her opinions matter, that she deserves respect, and that her worth has nothing to do with her appearance. The most surprising relationship transformation has been with Margaret and David's extended family. Not all of them have changed. Some remain committed to their cruel and judgmental attitudes. But Margaret's genuine transformation has created space for other family members to examine their own behavior and make different choices. Margaret and I now have what could genuinely be called a friendship. She continues therapy to address the insecurities and patterns that led to her abusive behavior, and she has become an advocate in her own right, speaking to groups about the importance of examining our unconscious biases and treating all people with dignity. Her work with Emma, who has recovered from her eating disorder and become a body-positive activist herself, has been particularly meaningful. Emma often tells people that watching her grandmother take responsibility for her harmful behavior and work to change it has been one of the most powerful examples of accountability and growth she's ever witnessed. The family gatherings that I now attend are completely different from the ones I endured for 30 years. Instead of cruel commentary and social exclusion, there are genuine conversations about important topics. Family members ask about my work, express pride in my accomplishments, and treat me with the respect that should have been standard from the beginning. The community transformation has been equally remarkable. The support groups I started have grown into a national network with chapters in over 50 cities. These groups provide safe spaces for women to share their experiences, learn advocacy skills, and support each other through the difficult process of standing up to discrimination and abuse. The online community has become a powerful force for social change, with members organizing campaigns for inclusive policies, supporting each other through difficult family situations, and celebrating victories both large and small. The women in these groups range from teenagers who are learning to resist bullying to grandmothers who are finally setting boundaries after decades of mistreatment. Many of the women I've worked with have gone on to become advocates themselves, using their own experiences to help others and create change in their communities. They've started their own support groups, challenged discriminatory policies in their workplaces, and raised children who are more accepting and inclusive than previous generations. The ripple effects of this work continue to expand in ways I never anticipated. I regularly receive messages from people telling me that my story has influenced their approach to other forms of discrimination, their parenting choices, their career decisions, and their understanding of social justice. Healthcare providers tell me that learning about weight stigma has changed how they treat all of their patients, not just larger ones. Employers report that implementing size-inclusive policies has improved their overall workplace culture and employee satisfaction. Teachers share that addressing body-based bullying has created more positive learning environments for all students. If this empowerment story for plus-size women touched your soul, hit that like button and comment on how this story inspired you. Looking at the complete transformation of my life, I'm struck by how it all began with a single moment of decision in that hotel ballroom. The choice to refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, to say no more to decades of abuse and discrimination, opened doors I never knew existed and created possibilities I never dared to imagine. The journey from victim to advocate, from silence to voice, From shame to empowerment has been the most important work of my life. It has given me purpose, community, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that your struggles have meaning and that your pain can be transformed into something that helps others. As I bring this story to a close, I want to speak directly to every woman who is watching this video and recognizing pieces of her own experience in mine. If you are a plus-size woman who has been made to feel less than worthy because of your body, if you have family members who treat your size as a character flaw, if you have spent years apologizing for taking up space in the world, I want you to know that your story doesn't have to end with their judgment. The transformation that began for me at age 58 in that hotel ballroom can begin for you today, wherever you are, whatever your circumstances. You don't need permission from anyone else to demand respect and dignity. You don't need to wait until you lose weight, change careers, or find different people to surround yourself with. You can start exactly where you are, with exactly the body you have, and begin the process of reclaiming your worth. The first step is recognizing that the cruel voices in your head, the ones telling you that you're not good enough, not attractive, enough, not worthy enough, are not your voices. They are the internalized messages of a society that profits from your self-hatred, of family members who use your insecurities to feel better about themselves, of systems that are designed to keep women small and compliant. You have the right to reject those messages completely. You have the right to look in the mirror and see a valuable human being whose worth has absolutely nothing to do with dress size. You have the right to take up space, to express your opinions, to pursue your dreams, and to demand that the people in your life treat you with basic human decency. The process of transformation is not easy, and it's not quick. It requires courage to challenge people and systems that have been treating you poorly for years. It requires the strength to walk away from relationships that are built on your acceptance of abuse. It requires the vulnerability to reach out for support and the patience to rebuild your self-worth from the ground up. But I promise you, from the bottom of my heart, that the work is worth it. The woman you can become, confident, empowered, unapologetic about your existence, is waiting for you to claim her. The life you can create, filled with respect, purpose, and genuine love, is possible for you regardless of what you've been told about your limitations. You deserve to be surrounded by people who celebrate your accomplishments rather than focus on your appearance. You deserve to work in environments where your contributions are valued and your potential is recognized. You deserve to move through the world without constantly monitoring yourself for the comfort of others. You deserve to eat food without commentary, to wear clothes that make you feel beautiful, to participate in activities that bring you joy. You deserve to have opinions, to take up space, to be heard and seen and respected. You deserve all of this not because you've earned it by meeting someone else's standards, but because you are a human being with inherent dignity and worth. The path forward begins with small acts of self-advocacy. It might start with responding to an inappropriate comment instead of ignoring it. It might begin with setting a boundary with a family member who has been treating you poorly. It might involve applying for a job you want instead of assuming you're not qualified. It might mean wearing a dress that shows your body instead of hiding it. Each small act of self-respect builds your capacity for larger ones. Each time you refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, you strengthen the voice that will eventually speak up in more significant situations. Each boundary you set teaches you that you have the right to protect your dignity and well-being. Find your community. Seek out other women who understand your experiences and can support you through the difficult process of change. Whether that's online groups, local support meetings, or friendships with people who respect you regardless of your size, you need people who will remind you of your worth when the old voices try to convince you otherwise. Educate yourself about the realities of size discrimination and the myths that have been used to justify it. Learn about the research showing that weight stigma is harmful to health, that diets don't work long-term for most people, and that body diversity is natural and normal. Knowledge is power, and understanding the broader context of your experiences will help you reject the blame and shame that others try to place on you. Use your voice to help other women who are struggling with similar challenges. Share your story when it feels safe to do so. Challenge discriminatory policies and practices when you encounter them. Speak up when you witness other people being treated poorly because of their size. Your advocacy not only helps others, but also reinforces your own sense of agency and power. Remember that your transformation doesn't require you to become an activist or public figure. The most important changes happen in your daily life, in how you treat yourself and allow others to treat you. The woman who learns to love herself and demand respect from her family is just as powerful as the one who speaks to audiences of thousands. Your body is not a problem to be solved or an apology to be made. It is the vehicle through which you experience life, love, joy, and connection. It has carried you through challenges and celebrations, and it deserves your respect and gratitude rather than your hatred and shame.